Let's begin with the foundations. Welcome to another lecture. Today we consider Elaine Chao, an influential American business leader and two-time U.S. cabinet official. It is important to understand how her career in labor and transportation policy intersected with immigration, governance, and ethics oversight in the United States.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. I'm excited, and a little intimidated, to talk about someone who has held 2 cabinet posts. It makes me wonder how policy, politics, and personal biography all fit together in one life story.
To frame our discussion, Elaine Chao served as Secretary of Labor from 2001 to 2009 and as Secretary of Transportation from 2017 to 2021. She was the first Asian American woman to serve in a U.S. presidential cabinet and the only cabinet member to serve all 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, since Frances Perkins set the earlier benchmark. Beyond government, she has been active on corporate and nonprofit boards, and in 2025 she was named a trustee of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts.
Maybe before we go too deep, can we define a few terms we might use a lot today? I think it will help set the baseline.
Of course. Wai Shengren refers to Chinese who left mainland China for Taiwan around the late 1940s and their descendants. This is salient to Chao's family background. The Taft-Hartley Act is a 1947 U.S. labor law that, among other provisions, empowers the president to seek injunctions in certain labor disputes that imperil the national health or safety. The Peace Corps is a U.S. volunteer program that advances technical assistance and cultural exchange abroad. As director in the early 1990s, Chao opened first-ever programs in several post-communist and former Soviet states. Deferred stock units are non-transferable stock equivalent awards that convert later into stock or cash. They arose in ethics discussions about her transition back into office. Finally, an inspector general is an independent oversight official within an agency who audits and investigates to prevent waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct.
That helps. And it already signals how her life touches labor law, foreign service, and financial ethics frameworks all at once, which is a lot for one episode.
Moving forward, why should we care? In this context, her Labor Department tenure shaped compliance assistance versus enforcement debates. Her transportation leadership affected drones, automated vehicles, commercial space, and pandemic logistics. And her trajectory as a Taiwanese-born American in national leadership illustrates representational milestones and the social frictions that accompany them.
I also think the stakes include public trust. When someone breaks a barrier, scrutiny can be sharper. Sometimes that clarifies standards, and sometimes it polarizes perception. Both dynamics matter for how future leaders are received.
Let's start with the history. Elaine Chao was born in Taipei in 1953 to Ruth Mulan Chu Chao and James S.C. Chao. Her parents were Wai Shengren, who fled mainland China amid the Civil War, resettled in Taiwan, and ultimately emigrated to the United States. At age 8, she arrived in New York after a 37-day freight ship voyage, speaking no English. The family lived in a 1-bedroom apartment while her father worked 3 jobs. She became a U.S. citizen at 19. She later earned a B.A. in economics from Mount Holyoke and an MBA from Harvard Business School, with a semester at Dartmouth studying money and banking in between.
Isn't it interesting how that immigrant arc keeps reappearing later? Like the focus on work, compliance, and institutions. I guess those early constraints often echo in policy preferences.
Indeed. Before cabinet service, she worked in finance at Citicorp and at Bank of America's Capital Markets Group, then entered government through a White House fellowship. At the Department of Transportation, she rose to Deputy Administrator of the Maritime Administration, chaired the Federal Maritime Commission, and served as Deputy Secretary of Transportation under George H.W. Bush. She then directed the Peace Corps, expanded it into post-communist and former Soviet states, and later led United Way of America in a governance turnaround following the alimony scandal. Subsequently, she served as Secretary of Labor for 8 years, returned to the private and nonprofit sectors, and then served as Secretary of Transportation from 2017 to 2021. Speaking of personal connection, as someone who teaches public administration, I often tell students that institutions remember. Chao's lengthy tenure at Labor, the Peace Corps expansions, and her later transportation initiatives create a documentary record we can interrogate. We observe that choices about compliance versus enforcement, or innovation versus safety, are not solved problems but managed tensions that recur across decades.
So yeah, moving on. Could we pose the big questions we want to answer? It helps me keep my notes tidy.
This logically leads us to 3 inquiries. First, a historical question. How did her Peace Corps initiatives influence post-communist Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space? Second, a counterfactual. What if the 2002 Taft-Hartley injunction had not been used during the West Coast ports dispute? Third, an open governance question. How do her ethics controversies shape perceptions of public service integrity today? Let's proceed to the next point. Question 1. In the early 1990s, as Peace Corps Director, Chao initiated first-ever programs in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Russia. Volunteers focused on English language instruction, business development, and civil society support during fragile transitions. It's crucial to understand that such deployments are low-cost, high-symbolism instruments. They embed Americans in local schools and municipal offices, where norms of transparency, entrepreneurship, and community service are modeled daily. Over time, we can infer that these micro-interactions produce alumni networks among host country teachers, local officials, and small business owners. Those networks often become mid-level civil servants, journalists, or entrepreneurs a decade later. In simpler terms, the Peace Corps plants human capital and trust that compounds slowly.
I'm curious about the long run. Do we have evidence that those early 1990s programs changed US relationships with those countries later? Like, not just goodwill, but practical cooperation?
To elaborate, causality in international relations is rarely monocausal. However, we observe that host institutions often maintain partnerships with American universities and NGOs seeded by volunteer projects. Alumni of Peace Corps language and business programs have staffed municipal development offices, chambers of commerce, and schools that later hosted USAID or exchange projects. Theoretically, this facilitates smoother policy dialogues on education, small enterprise, and civil society. The key point is that Chao's decision to expand into those geographies at a pivotal moment placed an American volunteer presence inside emergent civic ecosystems, and that presence has been resilient even amid geopolitical volatility.
So, I guess those decisions look small close up, but they scale over time. Like compounding interest, but in social trust rather than money.
Exactly. Soft power is a slow accrual process. And in this case, the early 1990s expansion is one of the clearer instances where timing amplified effect. On to our next point, question 2. In 2002, the West Coast ports dispute triggered an economic shock, with losses estimated near $1 billion per day. The administration sought a national emergency injunction under the Taft-Hartley Act, the first such use since 1971. Let us consider the counterfactual, where no injunction is used. Port closures would likely have extended the shock, interacting with just-in-time inventories, low buffer stocks, and the bullwhip effect in supply chains. Price elasticities for essential inputs would have driven substitution costs, while perishable goods and seasonal retail would have experienced irreversible losses.
Can we maybe now look at the global side? If the shutdown kept going, how would East Asian exporters and US consumers have felt it? Would it have changed sourcing or logistics permanently?
Mathematically, longer disruptions increase the probability of structural adaptation. Extended closure would have raised the expected value of diversifying gateways and nearshoring some capacity. We would have observed modal shifts to air freight for high-value goods and potential reallocation to Gulf or East Coast ports, albeit with congestion penalties. On the demand side, stockouts would have reduced consumer surplus and shifted holiday retail curves. On the labor side, union bargaining leverage might have increased in the short term, but faced political pushback if national economic harm escalated. In conclusion, the injunction compressed the tail risk. Without it, we plausibly get a wider and more persistent logistics reconfiguration, with higher long-run costs for certain sectors.
That makes sense. The paradox is that an extraordinary tool preserved the ordinary functioning of supply chains, which is both reassuring and a little unsettling.
Let's shift focus to question 3, ethics and public trust. During Chao's tenure at Transportation, the DOT Inspector General reported concerns in 2021 about use of staff for personal tasks and promotional activities involving her family. DOJ declined to open a criminal investigation after a 2020 referral, leaving the matter at administrative findings. Separate scrutiny examined interviews with her father and a planned 2017 China trip that was canceled. On grants, a liaison designated to assist Kentucky applicants drew attention, yet the DOT Inspector General later reported no evidence of steering or irregularities. Regarding deferred stock units from Vulcan Materials, she sold the units in 2019 after press reports, and an IG review found no financial conflict of interest.
So, what does that do to public perception? I often think the distinction between administrative and criminal thresholds is invisible to most people. They just see headlines and draw conclusions.
It is worth noting that oversight and prosecution operate on different standards. Administrative findings can identify poor judgment or policy gaps without establishing criminal intent. Public trust, however, is Bayesian. Citizens update beliefs with noisy signals. Claims that she or her spouse made millions from China due to the family shipping company were rated spurious by fact-checkers at the Washington Post. Yet the optics of family business proximity to policy domains increase perceived risk. Future research should examine how IG reports, DOJ declinations, and media framing interact to shape durable attitudes toward institutional integrity.
From a different angle, representation also intersects with trust. She condemned anti-Asian slurs and harassment, and I wonder how identity attacks complicate evaluations of ethics stories. It seems like two conversations blending into one public narrative.
Arguably, identity-based attacks can create defensive polarization, making neutral evaluation more difficult. Nonetheless, transparent recusal practices and prompt divestiture, where applicable, remain the most robust instruments for preserving confidence, irrespective of background. In simpler terms, the best antidote to noise is procedure followed with discipline. As we continue, a brief synthesis. Chao's public record spans crisis management at United Way, first ever Peace Corps footprints in transitional states, the 2002 ports intervention context at labor, and later innovation agendas at transportation, including drone integration pilots, the Net Council on Emerging Technologies, and proposed remote ID. During COVID-19, DOT under her leadership pressed airlines to honor refund rules and kept trucking corridors functional. The legislative branch, for its part, checked proposed cuts to certain shipyard programs, illustrating the separation of powers at work.
And outside government, there is the governance footprint on boards like Kroger, ChargePoint, Mobileye, and earlier Wells Fargo and News Corp, plus major family philanthropy, including the Ruth Moulin Chu Chao Center at Harvard Business School. It paints a picture of someone operating at multiple institutional layers at once.
To summarize, we began with the definition of Elaine Chao as a two-time cabinet official and business director. We examined how Peace Corps deployments functioned as soft power in the early 1990s. We explored the counterfactual of not invoking Taft-Hartley in 2002 and its likely macro-logistics consequences. And we analyzed how ethics oversight, administrative findings, and DOJ declinations jointly affect perceptions of integrity. For further study, one might consider how ethnic representation interacts with public evaluations of policy performance under conditions of media contestation.
So, I guess that kind of sums it up. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Professor.
This then completes our present analysis. Until next time.